Good morning. Yeah, like she said, our boys were all born in Japan and they got that Made in Japan sticker. Do you have one of those? No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So, welcome to Getting the Story Right. Do I have to stand here? Welcome to Getting the Story Right. And we're going to talk about how to make sense of the chaos that's all around us. As you learn, my wife and I were missionaries, our missionaries with SEND International, and we spent 15 years in Japan. But my first experience in Japan was as a student. In the middle of my college career, I took a gap year, and I decided to go to Japan, taught English in 4 churches in Osaka, and through that year, just made a number of observations about what was going on and what was taking place there. A couple of things that I observed were that people everywhere want to belong. People everywhere want to belong. They look for cues. They just pick up what's going on around them and they try to fit in. We were in Japan, this is back in the day, so there wasn't a lot of English going on. And so on our day off, I was there with another guy from the same college. On our days off, we would often go downtown to Umeda and get into this movie theater that showed old black and white English movies. We just were dying for English. And so they had these black and white movies, Streetcar Named Desire, Wuthering Heights, those kind of things. And they'd have the Japanese subtitles underneath. So we're sitting in this movie theater we were the only foreigners there. All these other Japanese people were watching these movies. And we started to realize that whenever we laughed, the people around us laughed right away. And we knew, well, there's a little bit of a lag because you got to read the subtitle to, and try to. And so we decided to test out our idea. And we got to the serious part of the movie, and we'd nudge each other, and we'd break out laughing, and everybody around us would start laughing, and then they're reading the subtitles trying to figure out what's going on here. They just wanted to belong. We all want to belong. Another thing that I learned was that the best way to your host's heart is through your stomach. So I would teach English at a church and typically teach from 4 o'clock on and teach a bunch of kids' classes. And then we'd have supper and then the adults would come in and teach all evening. And typically the pastor's wife would make supper and come and serve it. And so at this one particular church, this pastor's wife, she would increasingly get adventuresome with her cuisine. Because I never asked what it was, I just ate it all, right? Good tip, don't ask later. If you're going to ask later. Don't ask before. So this one night she comes in, and typically she would come in and she'd set down this tray in front of me, and then she would walk away, you know. But this one night she came and she put it down, and then she just stood there, and I was like, "Whew, okay, something's going on here, right?" So look down, and there's this white bowl of rice, love Japanese rice, and some green cucumbers, and. Someone speak Japanese, you help me. And then there's this bowl, and I look down, and it's like octopus tentacles cut up, and they're raw, and they got a little bit of soy sauce on top, right? And so it's like, she never knew what it felt like for me to eat something that tastes like eraser butts, or that got stuck on the inside of your mouth, you know. But to put it down, and like best friends forever after that. She was totally my friend. I also discovered, now this is not going to make sense to you very much because you're from SoCal here, but I come from Canada, and in wintertime it's cold, yes, thank you. And it's cold, and in Japan, where it's also cold, they don't heat the whole building, they just heat room to room, and so the toilet is always freezing, and heated toilet seats are really nice in wintertime. It's not much of an export opportunity here to Southern California, but up in Canada, that's a big deal. But the biggest thing that was a surprise for me living in Japan were the trains. Now, in the big cities, you can get anywhere by train. It's just an amazing network and maze of rail lines. You can get anywhere by train. That is, if you can get actually on the train. That is sometimes a bit of a press, you might say. But some things are just better seen than me standing here and trying to describe this to you. So why don't you just check out this video. We fondly called this Crush Hour, and while we were going to language school, we had to do this for 2 years. So check out this video. This is real life, real people, happens every day in Japan. You can't see it, but actually people are trying to jam. No, there we go. While this is rolling up, our train station was a local train station, and so the express trains would go zipping by. And oftentimes I would see cruising by, the doors would close on the train and somebody's pant leg would be caught in the door. Or, one time you see a purse just kind of hanging out, just, This other time, this girl, she, got into the train, the door closed right on her ponytail, and so you see this ponytail just zipping by. That was my reaction. So a couple of fast facts about riding the train in Japan. You get in there, right, and you're pretty crammed in. And so if you have an itchy nose, you want to think twice, right? Because if you're able to actually get your hand up to your face, it's staying there for the rest of the trip. You're spending the rest of the trip going down the track with your hand right there. The other thing that you realize when you are in a train like that is that you can experience total body suspension. We have 3 boys, and when our oldest was 6 years old, he had been 2 years in Japanese yochien, kindergarten, and then we got him going to this one-room schoolhouse down in Zushi, down in Yokohama, with a bunch of other MKs, and he had to take a train for about 30 minutes to get down there. And so one day, 6 years old, backpack, all juiced up, ready to go. So one day I get home from church, and I say, "Hey, Bri, man, how's your day?" And he goes, "Dad," he says, "I had a no-feet day." And I'm like, "A no-feet day? Did Mr. Williams make you walk on your hands in class, or what's going on with that?" And he says, "No." He says, that part where there's this one train line that intersected with ours, and they stopped, or their train line ended there at that station, so all those people got onto our train. He said, "We got past that train station, and it was so full in the train." He said, "I lifted up one leg, I lifted up the other leg, and I didn't slide down." It's total body suspension, I've had backpacks, or I've had briefcase, just stuck there, just suspended. But I've never tried that, actually, but he did, and he experienced that total body suspension. So just grab that image in your mind just for a minute. Grab that image, hold that image there, okay? We got a train from that wall, one car maybe about this long, 3 doors in it, one car. You got a train like that, and you take 100 people from across the USA, north, south, east, west. You got Southerners, Northerners, you got tree huggers, you got the people from the belt in Washington. You've got all kinds of people on that train. And you, just 100 randomly picked people, and you say, how many of you, if you can get your hand up, how many of you actually know and follow Jesus? Not just Easter and Christmas, but I mean for real, you know and you follow Jesus. How many hands would go up in that train car? 100 people from across the U.S. How many? Shout it out. 34, I heard. 20, 12, 40, okay? Go to joshuaproject.net. You can find these kind of stats on that website. They would tell you about 26, 27 hands would go up, okay? You got 75 people who don't know Jesus, not following Jesus. Train car, this side. Okay, you get 100 Japanese from across the big islands, 100 Japanese from all walks of life. And you ask that same question, you get their attention, you say, "Hey, how many of you know and follow Jesus?" How many hands would go up? Shout it out. 2, 3, 5, 7. One hand every 2 cars. Okay, one hand every 2 cars. Is there need over here? Absolutely. Is there things that the church needs to be doing over here? Absolutely. Tons of stuff. But what I want you, if there's 1 or 2 things you walk away with today, what I want you to be thinking about is not just need, not just justice, not just clean water, not just food, not just health. I want you to think about access. Access to the gospel. How many people have access to the gospel on these 2 trains? How many people can go? Most Japanese and most people in the 1040 window do not know a Christian. Most people don't know where to find a church. Most people don't know what does it look like to follow Jesus in my village, in my society. When everything about society is telling me to go in this direction, you're asking me to turn around and go against the flow. What does that look like? An app on your phone is not enough. A billboard at the train station to say, "Go the other way," is not enough. They need somebody walking with them. Somebody who understands what it means to live in that society, that culture, that city, that village. to walk with them and go the other direction. Japan opened up a couple of other things for me. I realized, there's some game changers, you might say, just stupid things. Like, I grew up driving on the right-hand side of the road, and I thought that's the right way to drive. I get to Japan, and they're driving on the wrong side of the road. And yet I realize it's not wrong, it's just left, It's not wrong. I grew up writing from left to right and down the page. I go to Japan and I realize, oh, you write down the page and you go right to left. It's just different. It's not wrong. It's just different. Language, learning Japanese language was amazing because it opened up whole new windows about who God is. For those of you who know 2 or 3 languages, you know that there's expressions in those languages that you just can't replicate in English. They don't make sense in English. They're not funny. They don't do the job. So you really want to have just those expressions in language. In the same way, when I read the scriptures in Japanese, it's like opening up whole new windows to God for me. It's amazing. Jesus, in so many ways, just challenged my expectations, challenged my understandings of life and of living through going into another culture and trying to live for him in that culture. So, LA is a big melting pot, huge melting pot. And I would like for you to take a minute right now and just think about your experience here in LA. And have you come across something that's been like we're supposed to be driving on the right-hand side, and that's a left-hand side of the road thing. Have you come across something like that? If you have, share it with your neighbor right now. Just talk a minute or two. What has been like a left side of the road thing for you that you coming here, you just went, wow, man, that's different. I thought it was going to be this way, and it's been this way. Take a minute, talk to your neighbor. What's been a left side of the road kind of thing for you? Okay, let's bring it back. So, left side of the road experiences. In the same way that culture shock impacts you, Jesus regularly confronts the comfortable explanations that we put on life. The way that and he challenges our understandings of how things should be. For many in the New Testament and for us today, Jesus turns things upside down and he gets us to see things in a whole new way. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm just going to take a look at John chapter 9, and I want to see how Jesus radically altered the way the disciples were looking at a particular situation, the way that they were explaining what they were seeing and experiencing. I want to observe that, and then I want to ask, how do we get our stories right? Or more to the point, as Paul says to the Corinthians, how do we take captive every thought and bring it to obedience to Christ? So, taking a look at John chapter 9. It's a story of this baby who's born blind, grows up begging, encounters Jesus, and is healed by Jesus on the Sabbath. I love the Bible because it doesn't sweep anything underneath the rug. It deals head-on with the stresses and the tensions and the unanswerable questions of life. One of the hardest things in life is suffering, especially when that suffering starts with a baby. Suffering that turns into a lifetime of living with profound loss, unmet expectations, unfulfilled dreams. And it's not only loss for the individual, it's loss for the parents, it's loss for the family, it's loss for the friends. And you're dealing with this, I wish it could be, situation. The issue may be a physical limitation, maybe autism, maybe Downs, or any number of rare and unpronounceable conditions. Each has its own peculiar sorrows, its own peculiar way of turning decades into what you never dreamed or planned they would be. Life is different, and you weren't asked. How do we deal with that? The Bible is permeated with suffering and sorrow, and that's one thing that makes it so believable. It doesn't try to just skate past the tough questions. And John 9 gives us one window into suffering and God's thoughts on it. So let me just read a couple of verses. John chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. After he went along, Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud, and with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. So verse 1 sets the scene. As he went along, he saw this man blind from birth. Now we know that from verse 8 that this man grew up begging, and we know from verse 21 that he was at least 13 years old, because when his parents are brought before the Pharisees, they say, "Hey, ask him, he's of age," so he must have been at least 13 years old. So Jesus is going along in Jerusalem, and he notices this teenager or young man blind from birth. And because Jesus notices him, the disciples are aware of who he is. And tucked in this opening verse is a reminder to be aware of the marginalized. Be aware of those people who have no access to the gospel. Let sanctified ingenuity and compassion draw you to join with what Jesus may be doing in the lives of those people you would normally walk by. So the disciples notice the blind beggar and are trying to make sense of the situation. So they pause and they say, "Hey, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Back up just a second. How did they get to that conclusion? What was the story they told themselves that brought them to that particular conclusion? Like most Jews of that day, they assumed that sin and suffering were intimately connected. It's like somebody sinned and therefore now there is suffering. That was a typical understanding, typical story that they were telling themselves. And Jesus goes, "Stop, it's time to drive on the other side of the road. Here's the left-hand side of the road dimension," and he totally flips their understanding of what is going on. They asked a question of cause. He gives an answer of purpose. They asked, "Who sinned?" And Jesus said, "God has a purpose in this." The reason for this blindness lies not in past sin, but in future purpose. Now, Jesus is not saying that suffering has no connection with sin. Genesis 3, Romans 8 clearly make that tie, that sin or that suffering is in this world because of sin. But what Jesus is saying is that specific suffering is not always tied to specific sin. Take a look at Job. Or in Galatians 4:13, Paul writes, "As you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. These things were for God's higher purpose." And then disciples just didn't understand that distinction. The existence of sin in the world is the cause of suffering in the world, but specific sins are not usually the cause of specific suffering. So Jesus says in verse 3, it wasn't that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. There's a lot more to be said about suffering, but I'm going to move on because we're dealing with the stories that the disciples were having here and how to capture that story. Jesus is challenging the disciples to take captive their story about this blindness, to toss out the idea of fate or vengeance or curse and replace it with God's purpose and his plans and the display of his glory. There is no suffering outside of God's glory. He who controls the wind and the waves could at conception change the makeup of the chromosomes. God allows things to happen for his purposes and for his glory. It was not that this man sinned or his parents. This blindness came about in order that the works of God might be displayed in this man. There's so much more in the Bible about suffering, but this one passage is of particular importance. Jesus says that the purpose of the blindness is to put the work of God on display. In this case, it happened to be healing. The glory of God's power to heal. But there's nothing to say that it has to be healing. When Paul cried out 3 times, "Take this thorn away from me," God's response was not healing, it was not removal, it was, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. I will put my power on display, God said, but not by healing, but by sustaining. In other words, healing displays the work of God in John 9, and sustaining grace displays the work of God in 2 Corinthians 12. The common denominator is that God's glory is being displayed. We don't get to choose how. We get to believe in the character of God. We get to believe in the purposes of God. And we get to pray for healing. We get to pray for justice. We get to pray for provision. But we don't get to demand it. We get to pray it with open hands and to receive from Him, ready to embrace what He has for us. So back to this story. Everyone around this event is trying to make sense of what just happened. There was this healing. This kid they knew was born blind, and now he's healed, and they're trying to make sense. How did this happen? What's going on here? The neighbors, they're telling a story. In verse 8 and 9, they're like, it's him. It's him. And some other neighbors are going, it's somebody who looks like him. You know, it's not the guy. And he's standing there, and he's going, I'm the guy. I'm the guy. This really happened. The Pharisees are telling a story. In verse 16, it says, some of the Pharisees said, this man, meaning the healer, Jesus, is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were asking, how can a sinner do such miraculous things? So they were divided. It's amazing. In verse 24, the Pharisees get this blind man who's now seeing. They get him into their council, and they say, okay, now tell us. And they say, give glory to God, man. Tell us that this guy, he healed you on a Sabbath. He cannot be a prophet. Give glory to God, they told him. In other words, tell the truth. And that's exactly the purpose of the blindness, was to tell the truth, to show the truth, to display the truth, to give glory to God. They said it in their own words. They said it in their own mouths. That was exactly what was going on, but they didn't get it. The parents are telling a story. They're afraid because they heard, if you read further down in verse 19 and 20, that the Jews were going to kick out of the synagogue anybody who said that Jesus Christ is the Lord. And so when asked, is this your son? They answer, well, we know he is our son and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He can speak for himself. So everyone's telling a story. Let me just start pulling this together and wrapping up here. I came across this particular insight through a book called Crucial Conversations by Patterson, Greene, Macmillan, and Switzer. Crucial Conversations, they make this observation that people encounter something. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus meets a man with a withered hand, and he heals him on the Sabbath. That's the event. Religious leaders see that event, and in Luke chapter 6 it says, and they were furious. They had this strong emotional reaction to the event that they saw. And then they took action. It says that they started to plan how they were going to destroy Jesus. Here's this event, healing of a person on the Sabbath, super strong emotional reaction, and then they start making plans. How are we going to destroy Jesus? We do this all the time. We see something, feel something, get this emotional reaction, and you either shut up or you get aggressive or you fight or whatever. What happens, though, is in between the event and the emotional reaction, you've just told yourself a story. So you have this event, you quickly tell yourself a story to make sense of that, and then that story leads you to an emotion, a feeling, and then you take action on it. You wake up this morning, you come out of your room, and your roommate looks at what you're wearing and goes, really? So you turn around and you go back into your room and you change your shirt so it matches your socks, or actually that doesn't work here, everybody's wearing flip-flops. So you change your shirt so it matches your pants or whatever, and you come back out, but you're mad and you're silent and you just walk right past, go to the cafeteria or go to get breakfast or whatever. You're telling yourself a story. It may have nothing to do with reality, but you're telling yourself a story and you're sticking to it. We do it all the time, and that's a little thing. Imagine how important it is to get our stories right when it's big things. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised up against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. We need to take those thoughts captive and make sure that they align with Christ's words, that they are submitted to the truth of God's word. So how do we take these stories captive? I would say that the first thing is that we need to realize we're constantly telling ourselves stories. We are constantly trying to make sense of what we see and what we hear going on in the world around us, what we experience in the relationships around us. We're constantly telling stories. And then I would say, when you have a strong emotional reaction to something, stop. Stop yourself right there and say, what is going on? What story did I just tell myself that I'm so anxious or I'm so angry or I'm so mad or whatever? What's the story that I just told myself? And then submit those stories to what we really know about God, about his character, and about his purposes. Overlay those things on top of your story and align your story with what is true about God. For example, the disciples, they noticed this blind beggar. Their story, this must have been caused by sin, his or his parents. Jesus corrects them and he says, don't look backward to cause, look forward to purpose. It's for God's glory to be displayed. Then the Pharisees, they hear about this blind beggar being healed on the Sabbath. The story for some of them was, the one who healed him can't be from God because he broke the Sabbath law. The blind man's testimony to the Pharisees is, hey, don't project motive and identity on this healer based on your traditions and your understandings. Let his actions and his teachings speak for themselves. Or me. What are the stories I'm dealing with these days? Hopefully a lot of you have been watching the news and have been seeing what's going on in the country of Ukraine. We have a lot of teams in Ukraine. And 2 weeks ago especially, 2.5 weeks ago especially, we were in constant contact with our crisis management team out there, trying to figure out, when do we evacuate? When do we stay in place? How do we deal with that? And we had, plans, we had triggers, if this happens, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. And part of our escape route, if the airports got shut down, was going to be to go across the Polish border into Warsaw. So we had all these plans in place, and we're dealing real time with what's going on, getting all of this information from the State Department, from some military personnel. We were just collecting this stuff and processing it and just seeking the Lord on what to do, when to stay. And, the easy thing is to flee. No, I shouldn't say that. There's a time to flee, but there's a time to stay, because how do those Ukrainian people understand? What does it look like to follow Jesus in the midst of this kind of a crisis? What does that look like? If we can be there and walk alongside of them, it's a powerful thing. It's a really powerful thing. So we're trying to figure out, when is that time when we need to stay? When is that time when we need to get out so that we can come back in and bring healing and bring rebuilding and bring restoration? There was a point 2.5 weeks ago, I was in Detroit at some offices there and dealing with this stuff and getting information, and all of a sudden get a phone call and get told the border crossing into Poland is shut. And I'll tell you, man, my blood pressure just went through the roof. I thought, we screwed up. It's too late. We're out of control. I've got kids in this country. I'm responsible for them. What is happening here? And I got quite anxious, just like, what are we going to do now? Wishing I could go over there and help them figure things out. All of that emotional reaction, and I just had to say, whoa, stop. Why am I so amped up here? Why am I so anxious? What's the story I'm telling myself? And that story was, we've lost control. Our plans are messed. What if something terrible happens? It's my responsibility. And I had to stop and say, that's my story, and that's creating the strong emotion. Now, what am I going to do with that? What is the truth here about God? The truth about God is that he loves all of those people so much more than I do, that he is absolutely in control, that nothing has taken him by surprise, that he has a purpose even for this border closing, that he is going to take care of this thing. And once I put his story on top of my story, I was able to step back, take a couple of breaths, and re-engage from a position of confidence, from a position of strength. We were able to just seek out the Holy Spirit on what to do and which teams to evacuate, which teams to leave in place. The reason I tell you that is just to remind you that spiritual warfare is not something that's just out there. It's not just simply about levitating canoes or crazy things happening, in different parts of the country. It is not just out there. Spiritual warfare is right in here. There's a competition for our thoughts. There's a competition for our stories. And so Paul writes, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive. So how about you? What's going on with your stories? What's going on this week when you hear the stories of things that God is doing around the world in the lives of people? What's happening in your heart when you hear the story of God that starts in Genesis, but in Genesis 12, there's a story that says, I'm going to bless you so that you can bless others. I'm giving you incredible access to super good education. I'm giving you access to friendships and community. I'm putting limitations on your life. I'm giving you this life so that you can bless the nations. Matthew 28. Our story is not just supposed to go to Biola or it's supposed to go to LA. Our story is supposed to go to the ends of the earth. I was doing a college visit with one of my sons in Michigan. We were at a Christian college there, and I was having lunch with one of the professors. And this senior comes running up to the professor and was talking to him. And the professor says, excuse me, let me introduce you to Warren Janzen. He's a missionary. And the guy goes, a missionary? He says, I'm totally stoked on missions. I love missions. And I said, what's your degree in? And he goes, Christian camping. And I said, great. And I said, what are you going to do with that? And he says, I'm going to establish a new Christian camp. And I said, fantastic. Where? What country? And he says, what country? And I said, yeah, what country? And he says, in Michigan. And I looked it up later online, but I said to him, okay, I'm a 13-year-old boy, and I want to go to camp this summer, and I want to go to camp in Michigan. And how many options do I have? And I found out there's like 51 Christian camps registered with Christian Camping International in Michigan. In the state of Michigan, 51. Okay? And I said, so I'm this 13-year-old kid, and look at my options. Now I'm a 13-year-old kid in Kosovo, and I want to go to camp this summer, and where am I going to go camping? I'm a 13-year-old in Burma, and I want to go camp this summer. Where am I going to go to camp? So what country are you going to start that camp in? If God has called us to go to the ends of the earth, why are so many of us stuck in the middle? What's the story you're telling yourself that is saying that it's okay to stay here? Each of us has a journey. Each of us has a walk with God, and He's leading each of us. And I do not want to at all diminish what's needed here. I just want to raise the awareness that it's not just about need, it's about access to the gospel. I would like to give you one illustration. I'd like to ask a really good friend of mine, Gus, to come up and just share with you a little bit about one work of God that's going on among the Muslim peoples. And I want you to just think about that and say, what's the story that you're telling yourself?
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.